Economist Mark Jaccard wrote an article in a Policy Options magazine. It was published last week that has been very, very controversial. It's all about the political parties' climate plans, and some of the people who support those parties didn't appreciate the scores. So I'm going to talk to him about that. Welcome to the interview, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
Look, we've got a lot of ground to cover, so we'll get right into it. You gave the Liberals the top score, 8 out of 10. How did you arrive at that score?
Right. The previous Harper, Chrétien, and Mulroney governments, I would have given 2 out of 10. So in Canada, we have not bit the bullet, whereas other leading countries have, in recognizing that we have to have a rising price on carbon, call it a carbon tax, whatever, and some regulations. Those are more difficult than giving people some money or doing Rick Mercer commercials. And the Liberals, since 2015, have done those essential policies. And then the second question, at stringencies, so rising carbon tax, tightening regulations that would achieve the promises they gave us for greenhouse gas reduction. And so I didn't want to give them a 10. I do rank them really high compared to those previous governments, and as I'll explain to the other parties, but because I thought they should have tried to implement some of the final policies before calling an election, for heaven's sake. So I'm irritated with that. But otherwise, yes, they scored very high.
Before we get on to the CPC, just a quick bit about the modeling that you did. You used the Navius Research GTEC model. And so this wasn't just, these aren't your subjective opinions. These are based on modeling. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. I mean, I will say that these are my judgment calls. So there's empirical analysis behind this. So number crunching, modeling, just like we do with a pandemic. But then also I'm judging things about, is it realistic what you're in, we'll come up with that. Like, how are you misleading? Are you likely misleading Canadians? But the modeling, it's a model, it's an energy economy model. It's I work with Stanford's Energy Modeling Forum. We have like 11 models around the world that work together. And the GTEC model is right up there with the best kind of models. And what that means is it tries to bring in all sorts of things about human preferences, inertia in the economy, because if you're trying to hit 60% reduction, how did you get rid of all those people? Nobody ever bought a gasoline car again, and ones that had one. So it has that inertia related to what we call the capital stock, which is just equipment, buildings, infrastructure, and so on. And then when it gets signals like prices and regulations or subsidies, or even some of the what I'll call softer stuff, it can simulate those. And that's what the model does. And the NDP have used it in Alberta, and they are using it now in British Columbia. The federal government has used it, and many groups have been using this model.
Okay, so there's math behind your judgment calls. So let's talk about the CPC, because this has angered a lot of conservative supporters. You gave the Liberals, the Liberals had a climate target of 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The CPC had 30%, but you scored them at 5 out of 10. Why did you do that?
So, I mean, Andrew Scheer, the previous conservative leader, or Stephen Harper would have got about a 1 or a 2 out of 10. They were unwilling to talk about carbon pricing, which is so essential, about regulations. This time, so I actually want to talk about why the Conservatives got as high as a 5. Unfortunately, they still have a real credibility issue. In other words, somebody can, and so that's that judgment I was telling you about. Someone can come along and say, now I'm gonna put in regulations, which Aaron O'Toole has done. They can say, now I'm gonna have a carbon price, which they kind of have. And so I'm like, wow, that is an improvement. And they wanted independent analysts to verify that their policies would achieve that 30% target, which, as I've told you, I rank very high. So that's why they end up at a 5. It's more why they end up ahead of the Greens and the NDP, but they're still almost half of what I'm giving the Liberals, because Conservatives don't have a good track record on this. Stephen Harper said, I'll put in all these regulations, and then he didn't do anything. So they have a credibility challenge.
Okay, well, let's talk about the NDP, because as much as your analysis angered CPC voters, NDP voters were even more angry with you. The NDP has a 50% target for 2030, and you gave them only 2 out of 10. Why'd you do that?
So their target was a 50% reduction, which already, when you're getting into that realm, that's really hard in 9 years to get rid of half of your emissions when you know the system. And so already, if a party's going to do that, it really needs to map out for people how it's going to get there. And that's why I'm also not so happy with the Greens. And so the NDP haven't done that, haven't subjected and I think the reason is because they know how bad it would be. And here's in particular, there are various aspects, but they say industry should pay for every ton of CO2. And yet no social democratic, so NDP type government in Scandinavia since 1990, when they've done carbon prices, the BC government, the Rachel Notley government. So NDP, when they get closer to power, don't put in a policy that says we're going to hammer the steel plants, the cement plants, the aluminum plants, and their cost of production is going to go up 5, 10, 15%, and it'll put them out of business. So it's kind of ironic that the NDP are saying, don't worry, Canadians, industry is going to pay for all of this. Like, that's been this bogus thing where we don't make progress on climate. Vote for us because someone else is going to pay for it. It'll be industry. And you won't lose your job as a steel worker or an aluminum worker or a cement worker or fertilizer and on and on. So that is, in a nutshell, there's a whole bunch to unpack there, but that would be the biggest reason. They're not credible. NDP governments in power don't dare do that. So they're far enough away from power that they're sort of saying, oh, here's what we would do. And I just don't think they even believe it themselves.
Okay, so 50% target, you thought you gave them a 2 out of 10, but now we get to the Green Party, which has a 60% target, but you gave them a 4. Now, why was that?
So it's that very question we just talked about. The Green target is 60% is really going to be hard on your economy. And so we estimated that the NDP cost would be 6.5% of GDP, compared to the Liberals and Conservatives, closer to 2% of GDP. The Greens even higher at 7.5% of GDP. But at least there was some more realism. And a lot of this is policy that had been developed under Elizabeth May. I don't know how much they've revamped it, but she, and I suppose Annemie Paul and her team, was more sensitive to that very industry question that I've just been raising with the NDP. So at least they took this policy we have right now, which charges industry whatever that price is for carbon, but only for a percentage of their emissions. So it incentivizes them to reduce emissions, but it doesn't raise their cost of production to put them out of business. And at least the Greens had that, and that helped them to score higher than the NDP, even though the GDP impact of their policies are even a bit higher, but they had a higher target. So I don't want to penalize, I don't want to reward the Conservatives just because they had the very lowest target. Of course, they're going to have the lowest GDP impact. So I'm not just looking at who had a low or a high GDP impact. It's blended in what was the target you set, and then what policies did you do to try to achieve that. So of course, the Greens are going to have a big impact on the economy when they try to do that. And that's why, I hope that helps explain how these things, how we rank them.
Okay, that's the overview, Mark. Now we're going to get into some of the details. And I want to talk about the CPC plan first. It's been the most controversial leading up to the election. And I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate here for you, because the CPC has kind of adopted the oil and gas industry's stance, which is that the only way to effectively decarbonize the economy is through better technology. And the better technologies that the CPC have put into their platform are things like carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, small modular reactors. All of those technologies will not be ready till maybe the very late 2020s at the earliest, but more likely into the early 2030s. They're what economist Jason Dion calls wildcards. So my question to you is, would it not make sense then for the CPC to adopt that lower climate target of 30% and say, okay, we're not going to do as much this decade, but once those new technologies are, economic, ready to go, they're mature, then we're going to make up that lost ground from 2030 to 2050, and we'll do it at a lot cheaper. We'll do it at less cost to the economy because now we've got these wonderful new technologies. What's your take?
Right. So political leaders of any stripe in much of my career to do with climate have said, oh, we won't do a lot right now because we're going to do innovation. And so it'll be cheaper later. So that's not just the conservatives. But I want to tell you that Andrew Scheer, in that last federal election, just 2 years ago, said exactly that. He said, we won't have a carbon price. We're not going to have regulations. Those are silly. We're going to do innovation. And that was his line. Aaron O'Toole, to his benefit, or his credit, I should say, has flipped this and has said, you know what, we throw in the towel. We know we have to do prices and regulation now. His price isn't as high as the Liberals, but some of his regulations are even tighter. And all of these things are the only things that drive innovation. So this is like Andrew Scheer's argument was completely bogus for me. It isn't like innovation and prices are substitutable. You do one or you do the other. You'd only get that much innovation if you put in the prices and the regulations. And we have so much evidence for this around the world. I'm on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We just look at this all the time. It's just so obvious. And I know that Andrew Scheer's advisors knew that. So Aaron O'Toole and his advisors, to their credit, have acknowledged that now. Now, are they doing enough? Is their target enough? One can certainly dispute that. That's why I don't put them higher than 5, but it is a real shift. And especially when you think of, the Liberals and the Conservatives count for 60, maybe 65, and maybe 70% of Canadian votes is what they normally capture. So the good news is we have our 2 largest parties finally recognizing we need those compulsory policies and that they shouldn't give us a bunch of bull about that. And so there's a big difference between Aaron O'Toole and Scheer, at least there. Will Aaron O'Toole deliver if he becomes prime minister? I'm wary of that. I understand people being wary of that. And I think they're right to be wary.
Okay, let's talk about the Liberals, because one of the big criticisms of the Liberals from the left, and that's all the way from the NDP and particularly the Green Party as well, is how can you be committed to climate change and lowering emissions when you bought a pipeline and then you are paying $12 or $13 billion to build the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, and it's all going to be carrying diluted bitumen from the oil sands, which is one of the highest carbon intense crude oils on the planet. How do those 2 things square up?
Yeah, and I think, sometimes I feel sorry for the Liberals, because that's a hard one to, just the way you described it, Markham, I think is good. But sometimes I'm also, I'm also challenged by this. Basically, here's how I see it. Alberta was in a snarly mood as the Liberals came into power because pipelines weren't getting built. And they were very dependent on the US that was rapidly expanding its oil production through this oil shale and light tight oil it's called, but just digging it up like crazy. And so they wanted to get to market. You couldn't get a good price selling through the US. And so that's the argument for pipelines, whether east or west, Northern Gateway, Trans Mountain. And I think, but I don't know, I'm not I haven't had inside discussions. I think Trudeau just looked at this and his advisors and said, we better help them get one pipeline. And that doesn't mean that production goes up in Alberta. It means you might use less rail and truck, and you might get a better price. So less of your oil goes south, more of it goes to the coast, and you get a better price. Alberta, we're going to do that for you. But then here come our aggressive climate policies that are going to reduce our domestic emissions. And that's similar to, in some ways, what Norway's been doing. Like Norway is still at its certain production level of oil. Well, it moves aggressively to reduce domestic emissions in electricity, transportation, and so on. So that's my thinking of a defense of the pipeline. Also, I will note that 30 years from now, 40 years from now, pipelines and right-of-ways like that can be transporting biofuels, maybe even hydrogen with some modifications. So the right-of-way and the exchange of energy is still going to happen. We're not going to be in this wonderful nirvana where everybody produces their own energy where they are. You see that even with wind coming on in Denmark They build bigger parks of wind, and they have long distance transmission lines. They connect to Norway. So my point is that we're still going to have transmission lines and right of ways and pipelines. And so that would be my defense of it, but it is a tough one too.
Well, let me give you a slightly different take on that. If you look at the Liberal policies, they have committed to decarbonizing the oil and gas economy, the industry, while letting market forces set supply. So as long as there's demand for oil, they're going to continue to allow it to expand. I mean, we see the Environment Canada Climate Change, which is forecasting an increase of over 1 million barrels of oil equivalent in oil and gas by 2030 under the Liberals. And my take on this is they're going to say, okay, as long as there's demand, you can produce, we'll get it to market. But at the same time, you have to bring your emissions down. That's the kind of the bargain.
So I agree, that is what they're saying. And I think that's a good challenge. And their new policy, they say, is going to put a cap on emissions from the oil sands and have that lower over time, which basically says either this gets too expensive for you. It's like my story about steel and aluminum and so on, and then you're just forced out of the market, which is very possible because Alberta is a high-cost producer in the global oil market. So you raise their cost of production. It's not free to get those emissions down. But I do agree that that's the message the government is saying. I just want to acknowledge the people who oppose the pipeline aren't just opposing it. It's like, oh, if you get the emissions at zero in the production process of the oil in Alberta, then we don't care. They're saying we shouldn't be we have to stop fossil fuel production and its transport. And I understand that argument. But I do believe, which I guess is similar to what you're just saying, that as an energy economist, knocking Canada out doesn't do anything to the global oil demand. Better that Canada become a leader in moving to electric vehicles and not consuming gasoline and diesel anymore, and how we make electricity and so on, and be part of a global effort of carbon tariffs, agreements like phasing out coal. And so it's the total demand that is important in my view, and therefore it's just less important to me whether Trudeau built this pipeline or not, other than for helping Alberta to try to make a transition, as you said.
Well, let's talk about the NDP for a minute, because they actually had an interesting idea, and I've heard this bandied about many times on social media, and that is, why not use carbon budgets? And apparently they did in their plan. You're not a fan, and can you explain why?
Yeah, so, well, when someone says carbon budgets, what do they mean? Because even I and people I collaborate with, the Navius group that ran the GTEC model, we do our best, and we have a good sense, sort of a sense of the incremental cost in cement versus aluminum versus personal home heating to decrease emissions. But if government comes along and just says, I'm not going to use a price, which allows everybody, the people for whom it's cheapest to act, or a cap with a tradable cap and trade, but I'm just going to set a budget. How does that budget work? Like, so we try to model this. How does the budget work? Like, if they say there's a budget for cement, are they going to put a limit on every cement plant? Or are they going to say the whole cement industry? And if they say the whole cement industry, then I can assure you the cement players will start trading with each other. And now you've got the very policy we have in Quebec and in California. It's called cap and trade, and in Europe. So to me, it was a bit of smoke and mirrors. People are excited about the idea of budgets, but then they don't tell you what it really is and how it would function. But if it functions in this way where there's no trading, because I did hear a couple of NDP candidates say, such as Abby Lewis here in the Vancouver region, say, and we'll use no market instruments, none of that stuff. So that means no trading. And we gave the NDP a break in our modeling. We actually assumed, because their own policies didn't get near to their 50% target, so we actually used a carbon price to make up the difference. So even when I say the NDP are going to cost our GDP 6.5%, that's only because we helped them out. It could have been way bigger than that, depending on how these carbon budgets work. And they just haven't done any analysis. They haven't gotten anyone independent to do it. And so, yes, it's very suspect to me. No social democratic government in Europe, or in Canada, the previous Notley or NDP has done a policy like that. So once you get close to power, you have to worry about costs and not just this image of this sounds good.
Sure. Okay. Well, look, again, getting back to social media, your piece took a bit of a hit from people who questioned your methodology. And so I'm going to ask you a few questions about that. So why aren't GDP costs, aren't GDP costs a poor indicator of sincerity?
Right. Okay. And when you say they question my methodology, they mostly question me. That I once used the same word as someone from the Fraser Institute, and I once won the Donner Prize for best policy book in the country, and somehow the leader of the Donner Prize. It was quite entertaining, actually. But yeah, so when we use GDP, and then people would say, well, doesn't he understand that GDP is a poor indicator for all sorts of impacts? And guess what? I've known that since I was an undergrad in economics. And it's one of the reasons I went into environmental and energy economics, is because I didn't like what economics does. But GDP is actually, and so it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell, you can have a high GDP in a very inequitable society, or one that's even causing environmental destruction. And so you should always be paying attention to that. But GDP is, it's income. And if the NDP says, we're going to do pharmacare and we're going to do extra health, this and that, and education, and then we're going to subsidize people to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you have to have money. And the money for that from the public sector, from government, is GDP times your tax rate. Whether that's property tax or value-added tax or income tax or personal or corporate income tax. And yes, if you're NDP, they should be progressive taxes, and I agree with that. But you still need money, and it's the GDP that tells you that. So if you crash your economy by 7 or 8%, you're not going to have money for those kinds of payments. So I agree that GDP doesn't tell the whole story. That's fine, but it does tell you a good indicator of how much money you're going to have for all these promises you made.
Well, here's a question for you that I've wondered myself. And how is it that policy is designed to balance effective GHG reduction and at a reasonable cost? How is that done?
Yeah, and so, and this is where economists have shown for a long time, and I mean since the 1920s, Pigou, that if you use a price on a pollutant, that's going to be the cheapest way to do it. So but it is not free to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Fossil fuels are wonderful and have given enormous benefits to humans. So we actually have to bear some costs. And so, I mean, that's what you've got to be able to do. So then you say, well, what's the best way to get this done politically? Well, for one thing, make sure you don't do things that are really expensive. More expensive than they needed to be. And that's why people work on things that are, but it's also why, and you've interviewed me on this before, if carbon taxes, like in the United States today, are politically impossible, there are other ways to put in flexibility for the decision makers, for householders, because some people drive a lot and some people drive different. Like there's such a diversity. And the thing about a price signal or a flexible regulation is that it takes into account this heterogeneity of people. And so those who can do cheaply this way, like by giving up their car, whereas those, oh no, I can't give up my car. I drive a lot, but I'll get an electric car because now it's economic. That is enabled. What the NDP seems to be describing is some kind of, I don't know, police state, like where you would make everybody behave the same way, even though their costs, circumstances, and preferences are different. And so that's the background to the reason for market instruments. But I'm not a huge fan necessarily of carbon taxes. You can do it with smart regulations where you put a lot of flexibility into it, like the zero emission vehicle standard that British Columbia and Quebec have, and now the Liberals say they'll put in, like the clean electricity standard that I designed in BC in 2007 and was implemented, but now other jurisdictions are doing it, and the Biden administration is wrestling with it. So these are examples where you still allow that trading. So it's irksome that the NDP has to make such a big deal that they won't use any of these instruments. Like they don't like the word market, but why don't you just say allowing individuals to decide how best they respond to a rising price of carbon or a regulation that effectively makes it more expensive to cause pollution.
Well, I want to wrap up this conversation about carbon pricing and regulation by referencing an interview I did with Dr. Danny Cullenward from Stanford about his climate policy book. And what he argued, very convincingly, I think, is that carbon pricing alone won't do it. Carbon pricing alone will not get us to net zero by 2050. It takes a combination of carbon pricing, industrial policy, maybe some subsidies and so on. Now, is that what you mean by flex regs when you talk about
that? No, subsidies are different. A flex reg, like the zero emission vehicle standard, says, I'm sorry, auto industry, each of you has to get, let's say 50% of your vehicles have to be zero emission that you sell in 2030. And then Tesla will be like, oh, we're at 100%. So they're like, great, you get credits for 50% of your sales, because you made the target and then you were surplus. You can sell those to GM or whoever that is not getting to the 50%. And by trading, we achieve the target more cheaply. So, but Danny, I think it's fair to say Danny's a fan of mine and I'm a fan of his. But I would say it differently than him. I would say, actually, you can do it all with a carbon price. So if that carbon price was at $1,000 now, we would be at a zero emission system. The only reason it's not is because it's politically difficult and costly. I mean, even doing it gradually. And so I might say, let's see if we can't do flex regulations that are almost as economically efficient, leaving us, listen, NDP, more money for hospitals, for pharmacare, for all the other things you're promising everyone. Let's do a way that we have more money for that. And if we can't politically stay alive, the climate sincere politicians who are getting into government and trying to make things happen, let's help them out. Let's not ask them to paint a bullseye on their back, but let's help them with flexible regulations. And Danny and David Victor, who I think you wrote that book with, and again is someone I have hold in very high esteem. These are top scholars. He would agree with a lot of that.
Mark, thank you very much for this. I really appreciate you explaining how you assign your grades to the various political parties, and I'll be interested to see what people make of your explanations. Thank you very much.
And Markham, I just want to thank you because this is a challenging thing. It's an important part of the election, and I really appreciate the opportunity you've given me to explain in more detail. So thank you.
Always a pleasure.